One of the important features of the spinal cord that we talked about early in this chapter is that it is what mediates reflexes or pre-programmed fast responses that don't need to go up to the central nervous system in order to complete the pathway from sensory information coming into the CNS, processing, and then motor information going back out to the CNS. So a reflex by definition is something pre-programmed that happens very quickly, and they are designed to keep us safe. Like, for example, if you were to step on a nail, your response, if you were walking along and you stepped on a sharp object, your response would be to withdraw your foot very quickly and you wouldn't have to think about it. Now, a reflex arc is a way of basically listing the structures involved in the transmission of that signal from the stimulus into the central nervous system, and then from the central nervous system back out. So what we see here is 5 processes, 5 steps in this process, hint, hint, wink, wink. Okay, what happens in a reflex arc, generally speaking, is that a stimulus activates a receptor. Here, the stimulus is a nail penetrating the skin. Hopefully by now you can kind of realize that the receptor is probably going to be a pain receptor located in the skin, deep in the skin, probably in the dermal layer. And that stimulus is going to activate the receptor, and the receptor is a sensory neuron. The nerve impulse or action potential is propagated through the sensory neuron to the spinal cord. We can see that this is the posterior horn. The cell body is located in the ganglion, right? And then the nerve impulse is processed in the integration center, the central nervous system, by interneurons. You can have a relaying up to the brain by various pathways, but you don't need that pathway in order to initiate a response. Stop it, doggy. So you don't need that pathway in order to stimulate the response. And as you can see, my big black stepdog is ready to move on with our lives. So we will complete this video very shortly. The 4th step. Here we go. 4th step of the reflex arc is the output, the motor output. So you have a motor neuron transmitting a nerve impulse. I don't know why we call it a nerve impulse, an action potential, a signal, a train of action potentials to the effector. In this case, the effector is skeletal muscle, and therefore this is a somatic motor output. And the fifth step in the process is the effector responds to impulse from the motor neuron. It responds by contracting, and you withdraw your hand, your foot, whatever it is. So the effector is another name for a target of a neuron. The effector. In this case, the effector is skeletal muscle. We know that the autonomic nervous system, for example, has different effectors than the somatic motor system. A reflex arc can happen on one or both sides of the body, and it can require one synapse or multiple synapses. So if it's on the same side, if I'll go to this picture, if it is on the same side of the body, then it's called an ipsilateral reflex, which means that, for example, here in the stretch reflex or the patellar reflex, when you go to the doctor or physiology lab, maybe they do it in physiology lab, you smack it with the hammer, you smack the patella with the hammer, and what happens is there is a stretch receptor in the muscle, in the rectus femoris or biceps femoris or wherever, that senses a stretch, and the response of that stretch is for the muscle to contract, and therefore you extend the leg. This is a ipsilateral reflex because the receptor and the response is on the same side of the body, whereas If you were to step on something, yes, you have withdrawal on the same side of the body, but also you have to contract. Like, let's say you stepped with, I think the example in the book is you stepped with your right foot. You contract with your left foot so that you can withdraw your right foot, right? So we're talking about the wiring of neurons to their muscles. If it was on the opposite side of the body, it would be contralateral. So ipsilateral versus contralateral means receptor and effector are either in ipsilateral, they're on the same side, contralateral, they're on opposite sides. You may or may not need one or more synapses to carry out the reflex. In the case of the stretch receptor, the stretch reflex, you have direct communication between sensory neuron and motor neuron. So it's monosynaptic. It requires one synapse. In the case of the withdrawal reflex, you have an interneuron facilitating the communication between the sensory neuron and the motor neuron.